thank Nathan from Parabellum for organising this and promoting it out through his network. And a lot of people will have registered for the webinar but may not necessarily turn up live to sort of engage with it, potentially just because the time didn't suit. When we run these international presentations, it's always a little bit challenging to make sure that we can get a time that suits everybody. So what we had said was, even if people were not available to observe everything sort of at this time today, that I would be recording the presentation so that we can make sure that we've got, you know, this ready for when, you know, people are ready to observe or engage with the content. All right, so I can see that there are a few people who are starting to come online attendees. I have I can see sort of Gina and Sarah. I'm aware that there are a few people who actually registered for this webinar from PNG. So, and I'm aware that Parabellum actually have quite a bit of, you know, work going on in PNG. So if, you know, you're in PNG this morning, then welcome and good to see you. So I will just sort of provide some I'm just going to give you an overview, and then there'll be opportunity at the end for you to be able to connect with me directly if there's some other bits of information that you're keen to have, or you want to actually, you know, ask questions specifically. So you'll notice at the bottom of your screen that you've actually got the little hand showing that you can raise your hand. Now, what I'm going to do is, once I get into the presentation, I have Stephanie, who is our technology manager in the back end, and Stephanie will be able to answer some of the questions along the way, or what she might do is, you know, make note of what those questions are, and then we'll come back to them at the end. And if there's questions that you ask that we can't answer immediately, then we'll make sure that we take that information on board and ensure that we do come back to you actually with a response. All right, so rather than waiting for, you know, more people, because we just never know, there probably are a lot of people who just registered to get the recording, I'm just going to start my presentation from here. So let me just share my screen. So what we're talking about this morning is intervening early and preventing mental health issues in the resources industry. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this, Nathan and I actually met at a disaster and emergency management conference in October last year. And one of the conversations that we had was following on from a presentation that I did, which was about first responders. And one of the things that's happened sort of in the intervening time, I've come to the awareness that there's a lot of focus on first responders as a, you know, just a broad industry. And I'm wondering if it's because it's government based. Whereas when we start looking at the mining sector, there's quite a lot of, you know, issues raised, but not a whole bunch of solutions being provided, and not a lot of research being done either. So I was a bit concerned about this. And then when I was talking to Nathan about it, and I did some more research, I kind of could not believe the information that was sort of in front of me about just how bad the situation is within the sector. And so, because I'm very much a solutions for sort of focused person, I wanted to make sure that I could kind of come to this webinar with some solutions or potential ideas for you to look at what you may be able to implement within your own organisation. All right, so 1 in 5 Australians basically report a mental health issue each year. But when we start looking at the resources sector, we narrow it down, it's like 1 in 3. Now, that is majorly problematic. It's one of the things that people talk about is, you know, related to FIFO, but actually it's not. The research shows that people who are involved in residential or dido mining communities, or residential where they kind of live close to the mine, are actually just as high, if not higher, than people who are in FIFO situations. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons that that may be the case. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how we get into the mess. Oh, no, no, Siri, I don't want to try again. Sorry about that. Um, watchers talk to you these days, honestly. So one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that we've got a perception about where this problem, sits and why it's there. At the end of the day, it doesn't actually really matter what caused it or how it got to be this way. But if you are trying to manage an industry of people where a third of your workforce is affected with a mental health problem at any given point in time, that has a significant impact on the ability to be able to get them to work effectively, but also then the impact on the morale or the culture of the organization across the board. So it's a really important one to just be aware of. Now, when we start looking at the cost of mental health just broadly across the economy, the projections that have been produced by the Productivity Commission is that it costs our economy about $220 billion each year. Now, that's across all sectors in Australia, but one of the things that I think we need to kind of understand about that is that there is a large percentage of the community in terms of the contribution that the mining and resources sector make to our economy. There's a much larger proportion of the benefit to the economy that is made by the resources sector than some of the other sectors. And it's that impact in terms of positive impact on the economy is made from a smaller proportion of the people in it. So about 2% of the population work in the mining and resources sector. But, I think in terms of I haven't got the actual numbers in terms of our gross domestic product, but in terms of the outcome that our mining and resources sector actually has in terms of the positive contribution to the economy, it's probably more about a quarter. Now, one of the issues that we then have is that if we start thinking about the 2% of the population that work in the mining sector, 1/3 of them have got a problem at any given point in time. But when you take into account their families and the community and everybody around them, the impact that they have actually affects about 10% of the population overall. So we aren't talking about a small problem here. We're talking about quite a big problem. And my real concern is that, one, nobody focuses on it. And two, even when we focus on it, a lot of the research focus has been on the negatives. It's not really about giving people some solutions. And what I want to be able to do for you today is to give you at least some insight into some of the potential solutions. All right, COVID just made things worse. So we thought that $220 billion was a lot of money. Well, the mental health spending last year alone was $5.7 billion. And a lot of people talk to me about, why do I talk about this as a psychologist? One of the things that I should have been happy about was that COVID actually increased demand for my services. But the reality is that there are not enough psychologists to go around. There are certainly not enough trauma specialists, which that's my background. There are only 3,000 psychologists in this country to treat 25 billion people. 25 million, I mean, not billion. I'm looking at the billion. 25 million people. So the proportion of people who could get access to services, even if they identified that that's what they wanted, is there's just nobody there to service the need. And so this is a big problem, and it's a major problem for us in Australia. So who am I to talk to you about these things? Well, arguably at one point written up as Australia's most influential woman in mental health. I honestly think that the reason that I was given that title was because I tend to look at the world differently. I tend to look at the situation that others see as big problems, and I'm always looking for a better solution, a way to resolve it, not looking at the problem as, oh, it's just a problem, but always looking for opportunities. Now, this is my new book that I brought out in November, The Trouble with Trauma. I will be giving you an opportunity later on to maybe grab one of those at a bit of a discount for you for turning up today, and anybody who's watching the recording of it. But a lot of the approach that I take in terms of working with individuals comes from the approach that I outline in this book. One of the things that happened last year was that I really felt the pressure to provide people with a solution to their problem in terms of when they identify that they've got an issue or they were having some significant difficulties with their own mental health. I wanted people to have an answer. Where I live in Canberra, the current wait time for an appointment with a psychologist, and if you're a new patient, is 6 months. And, I don't like this idea that people have to wait that amount of time feeling that they're in pain and not able to get support. And so this book really does help to break down why trauma actually causes all of our mental health issues and how to resolve it. Because, as I said, like to provide solutions rather than just identifying a problem.
So I walked under a bus. I got hit by a train, and it felt so good. I wanted to let it go.
So one of the reasons that I talk about, you know, PTSD and preventing traumatic injuries so much, or even being aware of how much impact trauma has, is because I actually got hit by a bus as a pedestrian. This was back in 1993 it was. That song was actually playing. In fact, it got number 4 on the Australian charts. And well, I hated it, quite frankly. It was one of those songs that was, of all of the things that people could sing about, I had literally been hit by a bus as a pedestrian and I'd suffered PTSD. And I had a significant problem for a good 12 months or so. And I spent a large proportion of that working with a psychologist, working through my, the traumatic incident that had happened. But the reality was that the bus just gave rise to all of the previous traumatic incidents in my life, and I actually had to deal with all of them at once. It wasn't just the bus, because I felt quite stupid for putting myself in that situation. I then had to deal with all of the, times in my life previously where I felt stupid or I felt like I'd made the wrong decision, because that's actually how our memory networks work. Our memory networks operate on this kind of belief system that we develop, which we call our negative belief system. And that's the stuff that develops from our childhood. So this is the important sort of bit to understand when we're talking about our workers, and when people come into the work environment later on, we try and sort of just treat them as an adult, and we don't recognize that they've brought with them a whole bunch of these negative experiences from their childhood and difficulties, and they front up each day at work. And when they have other interactions with other people within the work environment, they will often be triggered to respond in a way that's actually about something in their negative beliefs that has developed in their childhood. Now, the failure to recognize that as employers is, it's probably one of the biggest reasons that we keep having these conversations going around and around. A lot of people kind of go, oh, you just got to separate, don't bring your life, home life into the work environment. You've got to really separate the two. Well, that's just not a reality. It's not a reality whether you're if you've got sick children or a sick partner at home, or in a FIFO situation, because they fly in, fly out, they go to work, and their partner's left at home with the kids trying to manage everything, and then when they go home, they just want to go home and have a rest because they've been away working long hours and not really having much downtime. So then they go home and they sort of start drinking or doing whatever, and that causes them friction through the relationships. That's one of those things that happens in a FIFO situation, but I would argue that's one of those things that happens within the sector as a result of people not being able to, deal with the reality of their, difficulties that they bring in from their childhood. Now, we can actually pre-assess for this stuff. And so, what I would love to see is that through the mining sector, once we recruit people, that we actually do an assessment to understand what their underlying negative belief system is, not so that we can exclude them from working in the industry, but that we can then assist them to understand it and help them to resolve it so that it doesn't continue to cause an issue for them going forward, and especially then not while they're working with you. So interestingly, when we have critical incidents, and I know you guys deal with this stuff on site, and I know part of what Parabellum actually provides a lot of people is this kind of early intervention stuff with medical teams. The importance of being able to intervene in the first 6 hours post incident for people is absolutely critical in terms of the way that we lay down trauma in our memory system. So, and recognizing this is not something that you would have heard about very much, I want you to just hear me out. If you've got an incident where somebody's injured in the workplace, physically injured, and they get medevaced off and they get taken, the 10-hour flight to the nearest hospital or whatever it is, the people who are witness to that on site all need to be worked with in that first 6 hour period. Now, the thing is that what tends to happen is we're so focused on the person who's been taken off and medevaced out of here that a few of the guys will sit around and they might talk to each other about it, but most of the time they try and kind of toughen up and don't talk about it. I don't want to think about it because it was gross or whatever. And they'll use a whole range of diversion techniques not to address how it's making them feel. And I think that that's the bit that's really, really important to recognize, because if we can help them to understand that there are a few things that we can do to support them in that first 6 hours, and in fact, it's critical that we do intervene at that point in time, and we help them to understand why, we can give them ways to actually do their own early intervention stuff. I talk to people about just a simple walk and talk. So pretending that it didn't happen or trying not to focus on it, it actually doesn't work. We need to be able to discuss it or talk about it, or release how it makes you feel. But rather than sitting around in the crib room with a coffee, if you can go for a bit of a walk around and have a discussion about this, what you saw and how it made you feel, you actually start to bring your arousal down from what we call that bilateral stimulation. And I can explain this to you a bit more, but it's really important that we give people a way to understand that intervening post-critical incident in the first 6 hours is really important. All right, so talk about the traffic light model, and this is also important if you are in a situation in which you do have critical incidents on site. Your organization will have a whole range of things to do with regards to the physical elements. So what we do physically, we take these guys here, we pick them up, we do whatever, but we don't really use that categorization system around those incidents to then support the people who weren't the injured ones but were observers to what actually happened. And this is a really important thing that could be reasonably simply put in place around particularly those critical incidents. But it's also an important one to recognize, even if we simply have two people in conflict in the workplace, that if there is a situation in which people get into a full verbal screaming match, that should be traffic light red, right? If you've got somebody who ends up walking off site or leaving as a result of an altercation or an interaction with another staff member, then there's an orange immediately there if they walk off and they don't come back. Because there are certain interactions within this sort of space that people can move past reasonably easily, but there's usually other elements that kind of indicate that we've got a bigger problem. And when we start talking about one of the biggest issues in this community of workers is actually the bullying and harassment elements that happen on site often, then we really do need to put in some sort of traffic lighting system that helps us when we're observing what goes on, or altercations between people in the work environment, so that we can start to see if there's a problem brewing, right? Now, the problem is that as human beings, we naturally avoid, we don't want to have confrontation. We prefer to avoid it. And even as management, we tend to look at these situations and go, oh, I hope that doesn't blow up into something bigger because, God forbid I actually have to deal with all of that rubbish, right? But by ignoring it or pushing it away, we actually we limit our ability to be able to intervene and stop it from becoming a bigger issue. So if there's anything I want you to take from today, it's trying to find ways to improve our communication at earlier stages during the process when we see that there's a problem developing. All right. So the reason for all of this comes back to the impact that it has on our memory. Now, in terms of trauma treatment, one of the things that actually happens is one of the most effective trauma treatments that we can utilize is called EMDR therapy. And what that does is allows us to go back to a particular point in time where a traumatic incident occurred, and we can actually activate the memory around that. So that might be, going back and thinking about that particular point in time. That allows us to, using bilateral stimulation, unlock the memory where it's located in your sort of memory network. And then with that mismatch of the experience as opposed to the reality of what that person should have been viewing it, like, and I'll use the example of the bushfires, for example. Like last year when we had bushfires in Australia, one of the things that I said to people is that we want to think about what you did at the time. It's a reality checking, right? Did you do the best that you could do in the moment? And it's in that moment that we have to then make the decision. It's not so much easier to reflect back after the fact and kind of think, oh, well, I could have done this, or I could have done that, or I could have done this. But it doesn't change the fact that in that moment, you did the best thing that you thought was the right thing at that moment. And this is one of the points that we try and bring people back to. The reason that we have a problem is because in that moment, we often have a mismatch in comparison to the stuff that we would have done if we had time to reflect on it later on. And often it's because we have to make snap decisions really quickly about stuff. And in retrospect, we can look at it so many different ways and we can play out multiple different scenarios. But we keep needing to come back to the point that the reality was that we made the best decision we could in that moment. Now, if we go past the 6 hour window and we're still telling ourselves that it's our fault, we did something stupid, blah, 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 we are going to develop a level of traumatic injury. There's no doubt about it. The research actually shows that once they've gone to sleep and the memory consolidates overnight, then the ability to be able to change the thinking around it is limited. If we get to it within the first sort of 72 hours afterwards, then we've got a better chance of changing that reality. But once we hit that 3 week mark, usually that's when that sort of story that we're telling ourselves about the incident gets cemented in. So when we kind of working with in a therapeutic way, when we're trying to go back and fix the problem, we have to bring up that memory as we felt at the time that it happened. We're using bilateral stimulation to enable us to activate that memory network. And then what tends to happen is there's a natural kind of progression where the brain has kicked in and gone, okay, so the reality of the situation was that was the best I could do at the time and everything's okay. We then create that new knowledge and overlay it, and then it kind of then gets relocked in afterwards. So I want you to understand that our memory networks are extremely powerful. They get activated from things like our sense of smell, our awareness and being in a particular situation. When we have a traumatic injury, the reason that we avoid going to those certain places again is because it brings up that memory. We also have physical body muscle memory. So sometimes being in the same position or the same kind of physical feeling in the body comes up, that will bring up all of the memory association with it. So it's important to recognize that memory is not just what we've got locked away in here. We have a lot of sort of sensation feelings that go down through our whole body. Our mind really is this sort of central core all the way through. That's why you get a gut feel about things. All right, so early intervention from a psychological perspective, we have three elements which we call promotion, prevention, and early intervention. So, the promotion stuff, as far as psychology is concerned, is the information that we help people to understand before an incident occurs. So, when we start talking about promotion activities where we think about mental health first aid or mental health awareness raising, that's what we're talking about in promotion activities. Strangely, prevention in a psychological sense is the first 4 weeks post incident. So, if you have a critical incident on site and you have then um, stuff that happens in that first month post injury or post incident, that's what we call in psychology terms uh, prevention. Now, you might go, that doesn't make any sense. Surely prevention is about what happens to prevent the incident occurring, right? Yes, in normal case, that would be what it is. But in a psychological space, it's because there's not a clear recognition from a psychological perspective that says that the incident is what causes the injury. We're still stuck in a bit of old school as far as psychology goes, in the sense that we kind of go, well, maybe, just maybe, that won't cause a problem, and we kind of hope that that person is able to repress their experiences and move forward. And this is one of the areas that I actually think that psychology lets us down, in terms of the way that it makes these determinations or delineation between the two. I think that the stuff that happens immediately post incident is what we should be calling early intervention. But from a psychological perspective, early intervention is what we do when we first diagnose a problem. So most of the, if we go back to the how we assess psychological injuries, is we use a thing called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Now it outlines all our potential kind of mental health issues, but we don't ever diagnose anything until it's been there for a month. And so this is the problem, is that that month we've kind of got this space of in time where we go, we don't do anything for a month, and we hope like hell that whatever's happened to them doesn't cause a problem. And that is actually the point in time that we should be doing everything that we can to help that person not develop a problem. But from a psychological perspective, what happens is we almost, like deer in the headlights, wait and see whether or not they're going to develop a problem. Now, reality is that the incident will cause an issue regardless. It's just a matter of how that person manages to, move forward with their life, or repress basically the experience that they had. So, from a psychological perspective, the early intervention point's too late. We've already caused the problem, and what we want to try and do is prevent the problem from developing in the first place. So, I talk about having a multi staged approach. So, when you're working in your organization, you want to be able to kind of have the promotion, prevention, and early intervention activities, so that when a person has an exposure to a critical incident, that they've got some awareness about it, so that they understand what's happening to them and they understand why it's causing a bit of an issue. But then we kind of actively assist them to intervene immediately as soon as we know that an incident has occurred. And this is why I want to say to you, it's not just the critical incidents on site that cause physical injuries. It's the bullying, it's the altercations that people have on site, it's the perception that we feel like we can't do or say anything because, somebody's going to, have a problem with it or whatever. It's traffic lighting those incidents, so that as managers, we can kind of recognize that there was a problem between these two, which means we need to check in with both of them to make sure everything's settled down and it's really okay. And not just that they've pushed it away until the next time that happens, because that's actually where the problem comes in. We don't mediate between people. We've usually got a power differential on site, and that's part of where the problem comes in. And most often what happens is the person in the lower position feels like they just have to suck it up and pretend it didn't happen because this person's got the power. And what we have to do is try and mitigate that differential so that it feels like from a psychological perspective they're on equal footing, because it's just as important, right, regardless of the hierarchy within the actual site, which is there for the benefit or protection of all workers, making sure people do what they're told. That's one part of it. However, the perception around, a person's mental health and how they're treated is often where that power differential needs to kind of then be equalized. This person's feelings and reactions and response from an emotional perspective are just as important as this person's, right? So often people in this position use power to actually make sure that other people in these positions, that they can feel that they're more important, that they've got power, that they've got whatever. Often this person has actually got their own issues, right? And there was a particular story I remember hearing from one mine worker about when they had a particular super who turned up on site, this particular superintendent, the whole mine site would go on to this really uncomfortable feeling because they just had to wait till this guy sacked somebody, because that's what happened. Every time he came on site, somebody had to get the boot. And it was almost like he needed to exert that power to feel like he could keep control of everything that was going on. Now, my approach is not to turn around. One, we can't let that keep continuing because the morale of everybody at this level is going to be really, really poor, and we won't be able to keep people kind of coming in. Secondly, it affects the culture of the whole site. And so that's not healthy either. What I would be doing is, rather than sacking this person, which is not what we want to do, we want to work with them to understand why they feel that that's the only way that they can exert their own power, right? And it's about being sort of open and aware and helping them recognize the difference between the two, and helping them to find other ways to actually, feel that they've got that kind of, control over their own mental health, right? Because this guy is not doing, he's not sacking people just because, they did the wrong thing. He's sacking them because he needs to feel from his own psychological perspective that he actually has the upper hand and he has control. And so it's an important one to just sort of understand that and unpack it. And we can use data to look at these things from a particular mindset perspective. We don't have to rely on people dobbing each other in. And that's one of the problems that we have in terms of the culture of this industry, is that there's a perception of, oh, somebody lagged and somebody kind of dobbed this bloke in or whatever, and then that person is ostracized. But there's a range of other ways we can look at where there might be a problem, okay? And we just need to look at the data, and the data tells us an awful lot. If we recognize that every time this person goes and visits a site, if we examine our data of people when they're terminated, and we start to then see a backward pattern, that gives us an opportunity to go to this person and say, hey, what's going on? Let's work with him to make it better, because each person he comes along and sacks just for his own power outcome is costing you money as an organization, in training, in all of it, and it might have nothing to do with this person's output, but that's just the way this person's written it up, right? So I just want you to kind of keep that in mind. All right, now education in promotion is all about that physical health, their mental health, bridging that gap between the two. One of the biggest problems I still have, and I write about this in the book, is that this perception that says somehow we get chopped off here. Anything from here up is about your brain doing stupid things, and we can deal with anything from here down as a physical issue. The reality is that if we have prolonged exposure to extreme amounts of stress, we will end up with physical health issues. It's proven. The same the other way around. If we have long exposure to, if we've got long-term physical health issues, like we might have an injury or something that happens that means that our physical body is permanently changed, that will result in a change in our mental health, or a mental perception of ourselves. And the two cannot be treated separately. They have to be understood as a bit of both. And this is part of what we do in that promotion element, where we educate your people to understand that mental health isn't just about somebody getting a diagnosis. Mental health is about how they're sleeping, you know, are they getting into arguments with their partner every time they go home? All of these sorts of understanding, right? If I'm not feeling good as a man, what will happen is I tend to exert anger because it's one of those legitimate sort of feelings that is accepted. And in this industry, really well accepted because, you know, somebody's just having what's, you know, what's up your nose kind of thing. It's almost an accepted part that men can just get aggro about things and then they just move on and get over it. It's a bit like the old schoolyard idea that boys would get into, you know, they've got a problem, they have a punch up and then, you know, it's all over and it's done and it's fine now, you know, and they just move past it. They don't really. It's just one of those ways that they can get that energy out and they feel like they've done something and one's come out on top of the other or whatever it ends up being. And then that new pecking order stays in and off they go. And that's much the same way as a lot of men deal with issues that come up in how they feel about themselves, because they're less able to speak about how they feel than women are. And that takes us down another kind of conversation about men and women and how they communicate differently. So um, it's no surprise then that we find that we get more women in sort of HR roles or those roles where we're looking at how we manage our people more effectively, because um, for a woman it seems to be more okay to be in what we, and I hate this word, but the softer skills side of things. It's just about people, and when we validate our feelings and responses and we give, you know, voice to them, then we can recognize that it's just about people skills. They're not soft skills, they're not hard skills, they're just people skills and communication skills. All right, so the thing with prevention activities, and this is the stuff that happens immediately post incident, the biggest positive we can make is invalidating that person's experience. So, and I said invalidating, not invalidating, right? So when we validate a person's experience, the thing that happens is that it gives them a sense that their feelings are okay and that their feelings are accepted, and that even though they might be in conflict with somebody else who may also be their supervisor, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to pick sides. And this is a really, really important thing. If there's one thing I want you to take from today, please understand that you don't have to find one right and one wrong. We can just recognize that different people in different circumstances can have different perceptions of what's going on. And all we have to do is validate each individual person's perception without kind of affirming that we agree with them or we don't agree with them. It doesn't matter whether or not you agree with them or you don't. But if you can validate how they feel, if you can validate their perception, right, then what we do is we make them feel like they've been heard for a start. And actually being heard is a big part of it. Even if you can't change it, being heard is a really, really key component to somebody being able to move forward. And if I can just get you to not find one right and one wrong, we'll be a whole lot better off. Oh, I went back one for some reason. Okay, so the early intervention part is really important too. So I want you to talk about in an environment in the workplace where we've got two people in conflict, mediation is key. You need a third party to sit down and actually assist them to hear each other, not one bombarding the other until one capitulates. And I talk about this in terms of our self-management system. When I'm working with organizations, I help to train people to understand that we all have our own self-management system and how we can actually utilize that framework, because it is a framework, that to help us move from one sort of area to another, that brings us into a place where we can negotiate and reconnect with other people on that sort of similar level. So I want you to think about early intervention is about, in a harassment or bullying situation, it's about mediating quickly. bringing the two people together, giving people an opportunity to voice it. You know, I'm not opposed to using a talking stick between the two. I've done that before. But early intervention is really key to making sure that this doesn't blow up into a much bigger issue. And so making sure that we can like address those issues. What most managers do is just hope it dies and goes away, and it won't. It just gets pushed down until it festers up again, and it bubbles and bubbles because there's this thing ongoing between these people. We're people, right? We have different approaches, we have different things, and for varying reasons we'll make judgment about others, and sometimes that leads us to treat them in a particular way. We have to recognize that we don't always need to like the people that we work with, but we do have to treat them with respect. And a big part of this is about helping people to understand that just because we're treating somebody with respect does not automatically mean that we're showing that we agree with them. And so it's helping people to understand and break those elements down. Really important and a really useful thing to do. All right. I want you to understand that in order to actually create cultural change, if you really want to change the culture of an organization, you must address 4 different areas: awareness, learning. So we need to help them understand that the awareness around the need for cultural change, that actually has to be driven from the top down. The leaders must be able to say, we've got a problem, we recognize that we've got a problem, and we want to fix it. So we can do a top down awareness. We help then when we bring in new recruits, we sort of work bottom up. We're helping them to be aware of the awareness, and we kind of work like a sandwich, and we're hoping to filter all the way in between. And then what we do is once top is agreed and then the bottom starts to get information passed to them, we then have to target that middle management layer to make sure that the information going up and down is consistent. So we have to be aware, but then we have to actually provide the learning. We have to give them opportunities to understand. We have to provide the training, the education, the reinforcement of that at varying levels within the organization. Then we have to give them chance to practice. We've got to kind of, practice what we preach. We've got to put it in place. We've got to monitor it. We've got to come back and make sure that it's everything that we said it would be. And then we have to make sure that it's outlined about accountability. Who's accountable for it? Who are we accountable to? Because one of the issues that I came across, and I wrote a white paper about this just this month, it's just been published, about the problem that we had when the Minerals Council of Australia actually released the Blueprint for Mental Health, which was back in 2015. And it was in response to some sort of Senate inquiries and a couple of things that happened, one of which was in WA, but there was an Australian-based sort of, whole of government approach. The Minerals Council of Australia produced this great blueprint for mental health, but the blueprint itself had no accountability in it. So the problem with that is that nobody, even not within the Minerals Council, was going out to their member organisations and going, so how are you implementing this within your organisation? Let's have a look at the measures that you're going to, what are your KPIs for the targets for all of this, and how are we going to measure them? How will we know when you've made change? How will we know that this is effective? Nothing. They didn't put any accountability in. So although they had a great bunch of ideas, and I'm going to address them and show you what they are, they didn't give you any way to make sure that, one, they were implemented, and two, that anybody was held accountable for them. So if you set a goal, and this is, I want you to think about a personal goal. If you set a personal goal, your chances of actually doing anything about achieving that goal are only about 10% if you decide that it's a goal that you want. I want you to think about when the Minerals Council of Australia brought out this blueprint, it was really like motherhood statement stuff. It was, the design for a new organisational approach in this sector. But it's like they never gave that blueprint to anybody to construct how this was going to work. What's the point of an architect creating great blueprints for, this amazing structure if nobody was ever given the contract to actually build it, right? And that's what happened in this. Nobody was given the contract to build it. There was no, enforcement of it through their member organizations or anything. It was just kind of like, here's the pie in the sky idea. Okay, you all go and do that. Maybe if you want to, if you feel like it, right? Maybe you can put some resources to it because it would be really good to do. They talked about the benefits, but they didn't give people any specific reason to actually implement the change. Less than 10% of people are going to achieve a goal if they choose to have that goal mean something for them. This was somebody else's goal that they said, hey, you should kind of try and meet this. There's no reason that we would normally do that. The only way that you're actually going to successfully achieve a goal is, one, you actually have to decide that it's something that you want to do, that you want to make a change, that you want to implement it. So that requires the leadership of an organization to agree that this is important to them and that it will happen. The next part has to be about they're going to commit to it. So they put out a public announcement that says, this is what we're going to do because we really think that this is a very important part of what we need to do to improve the outcomes in this sector. If you look at somebody like, Fortescue Metals, right? We know that in an environmental perspective, they are big in talking about how they want to kind of end up in this carbon neutral sort of space. And they're doing a few things environmentally to make sure they achieve it. They put it out in their press releases. They put it out. They're talking about the fact that this is their goal. They're talking about it in a public forum. They're going to that. What does that do? It helps to keep them accountable for achieving it, because we've seen it when world leaders make these broad promises and then they do nothing about putting it in place. People get really critical of their ability to actually lead change. So if you want to be seen as a leader in your field that really wants to lead change and improve things, you have to tell somebody that you want to change it. You have to tell somebody that you're going to find a way to make it different. If you don't actually find a way to make it different, that's okay. People can accept that, but they can accept it better if it looks like you at least tried. Where it's much easier to just sort of say, oh, that's nice pie in the sky stuff, but not implement any specific way to achieve it, right? But it doesn't mean anything. So if we really want to make it meaningful, we then have to be held to account. So the next part is not only just telling somebody that you want to do it, but it's actually making yourself accountable to a third party. Now, be that your shareholders, your board, or somebody outside the organization, some government entity, or some, who knows. There's a range of different ways that we could do it. But if you don't have anybody to be accountable to, your chances of actually achieving that goal are quite low. They're not impossible, but if you are accountable, you will achieve it to 95%, almost guaranteed. And all of the research shows that. So one of the reasons that we talk about we have so much of a problem in this industry is based on stigma. Now, I actually, in my first lot of research that I ever did in psychology, I actually achieved world first results in changing the way that we approach stigma by changing the messaging that we give people. Now, I did some research, and interestingly, young men, this was working with younger people, admittedly, but young men were far more inclined to change their behavior if they thought that their behavior was something that was biologically based as opposed to psychosocial. So that's the difference between my brain chemistry then goes a bit out of whack, and maybe I can talk to a doctor or somebody about that and find a way to change that, be that with a pill or something else. I'm far more likely to say, hey, I need some help if I'm given a biological explanation for why I feel this way, rather than a psychosocial one, which says, if you're just hanging out in your donga, laying on your bed, listening to deep, dark music on your own, thinking about how soon you can get out of here so you can go to the pub and have a drink with your mates, that's a psychosocial response. Now, if I'm given a psychosocial reason for, doing these things, like I'm just a loser who spends all my time thinking dark thoughts, I will not do anything about making a change. Whereas if I'm given a rationale that explains how my brain chemistry is affected, and that's, a big part of my gut health and keeping myself really, eating well and doing these things more positively, that improves my chances getting higher levels of serotonin into my brain. That means I can do things better. I can approach work better. I can feel better within myself. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I should look to eat better, right? So, how many guys do you know that actually end up having really poor diets and, choosing all of the wrong foods, and then they're feeling like crap, but they're not actually given reasons or ways to change the way that they do that, because it's just part of the, oh well, we want to, it's hard enough working 12-hour shifts, where part of the reason that how we keep ourselves going is by overloading on sugar and doing all of these other things. It actually throws out our whole system health. And these are all of the I want to say holistic ways that we can look at helping people to improve their mental health. And that's a big part of the reason why I talk about improving mental fitness rather than just looking at the negatives. So at any given time, there are 93,000 resource workers that are experiencing mental health issues. That's just the number in Australia. So when we start talking about that, that's huge. A big part of that reason can be there's a high proportion of ex-services personnel that come into the mining sector. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming all of this stuff on defence, but a lot of people, when they leave services, if they leave policing or they leave defence, they're often leaving because they've got some traumatic experiences from their work in that environment and they can't stay working in it. But they're not actually treated when they leave. They're not deprogrammed in the way that they respond, and then they pick up that experience and they come and they drop it in the mining sector or the resources sector, and they bring all of their negative behaviors and all of the negative ways they feel about themselves, and they also add to that culture. And rather than looking at it as, well, we never bring in any, ex-service personnel again, I just want you to think about that in terms of the broader impact on the sector. So if that's what we're bringing in, we have to understand that we're also bringing with it a particular perspective that we need to assist them to change. And I'm not saying it's your responsibility as a sector to do that. Really, it's defence and policing and all of those people who really need to deal with it. But the reality of the situation is they're not dealing with it. So if you're bringing those people in, you have an obligation to your organisation to make sure that you understand if they're bringing any of those challenges, what can you do to support them to resolve those things as they move forward in their life and as they work more with your organisation. Because the failure to recognise that that's part of the challenge just means that your organisation then suffers higher turnover of staff or bigger morale issues because it's just not addressed. Now, I recognise that for a whole range of other reasons, they're a really good resource space to draw from to work in this sector because they're used to, being away from long periods of time and all of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those things are healthy, right? We have to help them understand the impact that those things are having on them, because one of the most important things that we need as individuals is a sense of connection. We need connection to our family, to our community. We need connection to the people that we work with. We need to feel that we're connected to part of a team. When we come out of a defence or a policing area, we have a sense of connection to our team or to, our unit or to our station. And we kind of lose that when we come out of that sector, and we might look for it elsewhere. We need to find it. If we don't find it, we kind of stay on the periphery the whole time, and that becomes problematic. So you'll find, if you have a look at your staffing sector, that a lot of your ex-services personnel tend to group together. They tend to find, well, we're like a subcultural group within it. Well, we're the ex sort of services people and we band together over here. And if we fail to recognise group dynamics and how group dynamics affect our workforce, then we really are doing ourselves a disservice in understanding and working out how to make it better and improve it for people. All right. We talk about remote working. As I said, FIFO is one of those things that's talked about a lot in this industry, but I think sometimes it's held up as the big problem, and yet it's actually not the only problem. I think there is just as much impact on the residential mining sector as there is on the FIFO, and that's actually something that's proven in research as well. One of the biggest issues that we have in this sector is substance use. And one is because we've got a bunch of people who come in and work who I want to say have more of a blue collar background. So they may be exposed to, they may have parental relationships where the parents were, avoiding their own reality by using substances when they were growing up. And then it's also cultural, that rather than dealing with how we feel about certain situations, we numb ourselves to that experience by drinking or taking drugs or doing whatever. And then by working in this sector, we're afforded a lot of means, resources, cash, to be able to access it and provide ourselves the resources to be able to engage in those substance use issues moving forward. And that becomes a big problem. She's really noisy today. I don't know why she's butting in the whole time. All right, so the cost to industry for this is estimated to be 320 to 450 million annually. Now, I believe that that is an underestimation. And in my new white paper, I actually talk about the fact that that cost to industry was based on the fact that they were working on it being 10,000 people who were experiencing mental health issues at any given point in time in the sector. I already said there's more like 93,000 when we look at a third of the workforce. So they were estimating it to be, 1/10 of the workforce when it's not. And so the cost to industry, nearly tenfold what that says. It's in the billions, right? It's not this 320 to 450. That's based on 10,000 people. Times that by 9.3 and you get a much, much bigger figure. So the sector lacks a real focus on well-being and understanding that positive kind of outcome that can come from helping people to feel like they're living their best life, that they're looking after themselves physically and mentally, and they're making a contribution by being at work and doing a job that, people value. I think that's a big part of this, and helping you in your organizations be able to move this forward comes down to supporting people to become better aware of all of the things that affect them both physically and emotionally. And on top of what happened with COVID, and I'm aware that a lot of people in FIFO industries in particular, COVID meant, I know in WA, there was a lot, like people were locked down, they didn't see their family for 6 months. So that had a huge impact. And I don't think that any of that's really been addressed appropriately for people to understand how that's impacted. And it impacted not only them, but their families at the other end, because they weren't able to see their families. And so that caused some sort of bigger issues that are still actually affecting the sector. All right. So I just wanted to go through really quickly, and I'm not going to go through each and every one, but the mental health blueprint that was developed by the Minerals Council of Australia had these different areas that they highlighted that kind of gave you some actions and milestones. Like I said, they didn't actually identify how you should do it or who should be accountable, but I just wanted to kind of give you that cross link about when you're talking about cultural change, where does that change it? So the leadership elements that they outlined in the blueprint actually link to awareness raising. This is this sense that we have a problem, that the leadership are reinforcing the fact that we have a problem, we're going to do something about it. Now, the actions and the milestones are outlined in the blueprint. The solutions are the things that I'm suggesting that you should do, and you want to make sure that you've got these things in place. And when I'm working with organizations, this is the stuff that we do. I go through and help you unpack what the solutions are, because you need to develop a bespoke solution for the unique needs of your individual organization. And in some cases in this industry, that even needs to be broken down by site. And so it's an important one to understand that what we kind of might want to do is start looking at on a site by site basis whether or not there's some patterns, and we can pick these things up in the data. All right, so the accountability elements. So this is where in the blueprint it's outlined as effective systems and policies. I talk here about one of the main solutions that we do is look at developing traumatic injury prevention strategy. That's important to understand. When we know what causes those psychological injuries, we want to understand how you can put in place a number of different things around a framework to help you do that. All right, so one of the things that is really important then is looking at training. So the education, training and health promotion activities that were outlined in the blueprint, there are a whole bunch of actions you can see. There were some basic milestones, but in my case, I'm talking about the solutions. It needs to be more than mental health first aid. We have so many organizations that kind of go, oh yeah, we're just doing mental health first aid. I can tell you now, mental health first aid is seen by all of those people who do it as something for me to help other people. I provide first aid to other people. It's not about awareness raising about my own mental health, right? It might give people some insight, but it doesn't help them to understand that there are a whole bunch of things that are affecting them. And there are a whole bunch of key indicators that they can look at in terms of basic data, sleep data as an example. Now, you know, my watch has been interfering with this presentation a couple of times today. This tells me more information about my mental health than I can probably be consciously aware of. And what we've been working on is incorporating that information into a database of situations so that we can help people to recognize when maybe things aren't going so well because, you know, their sleep's affected, their heart rate's up, all of these things that we kind of know and we're monitoring now with these devices that we wear all the time. So it's a useful thing to understand about how technology can improve our outcomes if we learn to read it the right way. All right, then promoting and supporting access to care. So this is really like that part of it where we talk about the practice. This is about putting it into practice, what we're doing. So supporting mental health through, you know, employee assistance is one thing, but most people talk about the fact that the employee assistance programs that you've given people access to require them to wait until they, you know, they're at home or they can get access to it. Most of these mine sites are located in remote areas. We give them access maybe to a counsellor by phone or on the internet or whatever, but we don't give them access to specialised trauma intervention. And one of the things that I developed a couple of years ago was a tool that actually allows us to treat trauma online. And probably COVID actually helped us get more awareness out there about the fact that we can do this and that we should be doing this when we do that early, like when we're doing the promotion activities and intervening early. There are things that we can do on the site that we might be able to work with the medical personnel and give them some base training for understanding that early kind of what they should be doing as soon as something kind of happens or somebody identifies that there's a problem. But then if they need access to a third party or it becomes aware that there's a bigger problem, who do we refer them to? Shouldn't just be any old counsellor who's providing EAP services, because a lot of men do not like to talk about how they feel. And the type of, you know, trauma treatment that we provide does not require there to be a lot of dialogue about stuff, surprisingly. But as a result, more men feel easier to engage with them. And it's important that we help people understand that there are a range of ways that we can do these things. It's not just all about talk therapy. And in fact, for a lot of people, talk therapy is not effective. All right. So then, you know, we talk about promoting and supporting access to care as being that that practice part. And then these last two bits are the resourcing and partnership opportunities and the research and development. These are the bits that are about both awareness and accountability. It's about raising more awareness by doing that research, but it's also about reinforcing the fact that we are being accountable and what's working and what's not working. All right. But again, I'm providing solutions here in these tables because the Minerals Council only identified actions that you could take and milestones that you might be able to achieve them, but they didn't actually give you any clear solutions about what you should do or who you should work with to get them done. All right, so when it comes to recovery, where we talk about traumatic injury and then we don't want to lose a person out of our workforce, right? They've got a problem, something happened, might just be an incident that they had with another staff member or a supervisor or whatever. We want to help them recover. We want to help them get back to work and be working effectively. We want them not to take more time off or whatever. We always look at absenteeism statistics, but it's more about the presenteeism. What happens if I'm forced to work with somebody that I really don't like or that I feel has put me in a compromising position? I'm not necessarily going to be as effective as I would be if I was working in a place where I felt valued and connected and supported. So a big part of the recovery has to do with somebody's ability to feel that they've got some purpose in that recovery. So there are three keys to this, and one is about the awareness. So it's the awareness that actually there is a problem, that you recognize that it's caused a problem for that person, and we validate that person's experience in it. So whether we don't go back to, I said, we don't have to find right or wrong, right? It's validating how they felt in that moment. And then it's giving them a sense of purpose for moving forward. Whether that be just because you value the work that they do and you really want them to stay around because you really appreciate the work that they do. That's a pretty simple purpose. Then it makes them feel like they've been heard. They've their experience has been validated, that that was how they felt, that you're not happy that that's the way they felt. But rather than trying to find they were right and the other guy was wrong, it's really about a sense of, but we really think that you're important. You do a great job for the organization and we really value you. And that gives them a sense of purpose for staying engaged and delivering on their work. And they will do a much better job if they feel that they've got some sense of value and purpose, and the organization gives them that sense. Awareness raising. So one of the things that's really important in all of this when we're trying to help people recognize what's happened is observing that often it's about the process not working, it's not personal. So I often talk about where you get into conflict between, a supervisor and somebody, or, what we see often in the mining sector is somebody's being trained and they don't get it right and they get personally berated as being hopeless, useless, stupid, whatever. That becomes about the person. And what we really need to do is give them some feedback about the process. So if they're not driving a truck fast enough between one point and the other, or they're driving too fast, they're creating dust, whatever it is, we should be focusing on the fact that there are things that they could do in terms of their skills that might improve how they put that process in place. But what tends to happen in these environments is we make it personal and we start attacking the person. We start calling them names. We start, they'll never make it. We just derail the whole person rather than talking to them about the skills that they need to improve on and what it is that they might be doing wrong that's impacting that process of learning. Then it's about the validation of their experience. So this is what I say all the time about the perception, not the judgment. It's not about finding right or wrong. It's not saying the supervisor's right, you're wrong. I mean, yeah, there might be clear things that happened, but just because even if somebody's in the wrong, it doesn't mean that they can't be given a sense that they are valuable or important, or that their perspective is supported. And I think just this issue of validating a person's experience makes a huge difference to people's ability to engage in the work environment. And it really doesn't take much, honestly. It's a very simple thing. Then giving them a purpose for the future. It really is about the future, not the past. If somebody has a difficulty with, another person in the work environment, it's about mediating through that and working out how we can move forward together, not just because we want to tick the boxes and say that we did that, but it's about genuine, I value you because you bring this to, my work, that I'm bringing this to yours. Like, how do we work together to make sure that we can achieve a common outcome for a greater purpose that's bigger than just, you or me taking home a big paycheck, right? So that's important too. So mental muscle, this is a program that I've developed because, I find that particularly in these sorts of industries, when people don't want to talk about, therapy or all of that sort of stuff, but they are willing to recognize that if they engage in a focused program on building up their physical body, and I mean, I've done this, right? We go off and we kind of eat really well and we go to the gym all the time and we work all of this sort of stuff out. I'm talking about a 12-week program for mental well-being. So it's how do we improve our capacity or our resilience, and it's about focusing on building that mental muscle. How do we build into our responses and our awareness as human beings so that we can increase the likelihood that we're going to get better mental health outcomes? And that's about ourselves. So we do talk about some of those other things that are important in terms of, nutrition and the awareness and recognizing when we're feeling overwhelmed, that we monitor sleep and all of those things that are also physiological. But we talk about how we combine that with our awareness and building more of that self-awareness to increase the chances that whatever life throws at us and how difficult it gets, that we can always feel like we've got the resources to be able to deal with it and move forward. And so we can deliver this program in-house, or we can also, you can refer your people to us and we can just deliver that program online for those who want to do it from a remote location. So you can do it in-house or externally. So this is a really big focus of where I've really moved to moving forward, because we want to try and help people to help themselves. We want to try and help them to understand how they get to this and then how to make it better for themselves. It's an incredible difference. We don't expect somebody to go through a 12-week physical program, come out the other end and be okay for the rest of their lives, right? We constantly need to be feeding into this. So I talk about our self-management system, and I have a way that we teach people how to get awareness out of their own sense of their own self and breaking that down into a framework that helps them to understand themselves. It also helps them to understand where another person might be coming from in terms of, well, if I'm in this position, where's the other person likely to be? It gives them a clear framework to determine that from a psychological perspective. And that really helps to create people's self-awareness and raise it up so that then I'm more self-aware and I'm more aware of how I'm reacting or responding to others in my work environment. And I'm doing it in a way that's open and connected and consistent. And the other person may hopefully also be trained in the same framework, means that we reduce the likelihood of conflict in the workplace. So it makes a big difference to help people, when we help people to understand themselves, not in terms of the broken bits, but giving them a framework to clearly work out how they're reacting or responding, why they've got an emotional response coming up at all, and giving them a clear and rational way to move things forward really, really is a big game changer in terms of how people then respond in the workplace. So really useful tool. All right, I said to you earlier, my new book, you're being offered a 50% discount off this. So if you want to go to that link there, that's the kerryanhoward.com/50-off. You can actually get the audiobook through Audible at the moment if you're an Audible member. You can also order it direct off Amazon, but the print quality is not as good as if you get it from us directly. But it is available in multiple different formats. You can get an ebook if you would prefer. You can get those off Amazon as well. But I want you to understand that when you read the book is written for an individual. It helps you to understand yourself, but it outlines the framework of the self-management system. And what we do when working with organizations is we actually train your people to understand that self-management system for themselves. And when everybody's got that kind of clarity around it, it means that everything works more effectively within the culture of the organization, because we're all in a better place of understanding and self-awareness around how we're responding, but also how other people might be responding. All right, my challenge to you, we're coming to the end, right? My challenge to you, I want to inspire you to help inspire your people to make these things improve the way that we approach mental health in this sector, and feel that we can actually make a difference. A lot of what I hear from this sector is, it's bad, the stigma, nobody wants help, they're just blokes, they don't want to do anything about it, or we can't engage them in it. It's too big to try and create cultural change in the sector. I don't think that there is a problem that is too big to solve, but we do have to have people who are committed to trying to solve the problem to make it happen. If we keep kind of, abdicating our responsibility, oh, it's too big and too hard, so we're not going to do anything, nothing changes. And what we saw from last year is that as a community, things are very difficult all around the world. Australia in comparison has really got away with a minimal impact, I want to say, and yet it still had a big impact on us. So imagine what it's like in other parts of the world where it's still a big problem. And I'm aware you guys in Papua New Guinea have only recently sort of had a bigger problem come up. So you would be aware of this much more saliently than we are, I suppose. So the 3 steps around this that I would encourage you to do: review the way that your organisation currently approaches people when there's conflict in the workplace, and understand how much support or assistance you are giving people, one, in understanding themselves, but two, in what they can do to help move themselves forward when things are a bit difficult. Validate those experiences and reinforce to people the importance of validating anybody's, you know, expression of whatever situation they find themselves in and however they choose to express it. It is not our job to hear somebody talk about how something made them feel and then tell them that that's not right, that they don't feel that, because it doesn't make any sense. You don't get to decide how somebody else feels. So validating a person's experience, whatever they're telling you, then it's okay to kind of just say, wow, that must have been really hard. You don't have to necessarily agree. You don't have to sit there and think, maybe, oh, if that was me, I wouldn't approach it like that. It wasn't that bad. We shouldn't be thinking about it like that. We need to just accept that what somebody tells us on face value is actually how it was for them. And then giving people that sense of purpose, that it's important, that they're valuable to your organization, that you've invested a lot in their training and their awareness, and you value them as people, and that we want them to understand that you know they have a sense of purpose, because what they're doing is assisting the organization to get their overall goals achieved, and that without them you can't really do that. And that's true. You may think that you can just find another person to fill that space, but ultimately each and every person who makes the contribution is valuable to your organization. All right. So this is the white paper that's just been published. If you would like to get a copy of the white paper, please you can send me an email and we can provide you a copy of that in response, just via return email. But it's really interesting the things that came out about this and some of the data that comes up, and quite frankly, it's very scary. We really do need to make some changes in the sector. It's essential that we do it, and we do it quickly. All right. So if you would like some more information, or if there's anything else that we can do, I'm not sure if any of you have had questions that have popped up. Stephanie in the back end might be able to give me some indication about that. But I often work with organizations, and the first thing that we do when we're working with an organization is take you through a scorecard, which is the psychological injury risk assessment. And in order to do that, it's one of those things that we want to try and tailor slightly to make sure that we understand what's going on in the sector. And so if you're interested, you can just send an email to that more@kerryhoward.com.au, and I can make sure, if you want the white paper, email that address as well. And if you would like to have a look at that psychological injury risk assessment on behalf of your organisation, then I'm happy to do that with you. It provides us a bit of an immediate scorecard, and then I can arrange to have a follow-up conversation with you to unpack it a little bit. If there's more work to do after that, and it would surprise, like there can't be any organization that probably doesn't have more work to do. But it'll give you a good indication from that risk assessment. It clearly kind of talks about your big area that you probably should focus on first. So it looks at 4 different areas, and then I can give you some guidance on what you might want to do first, and how you might go about doing that. So that's just a really useful tool for you to be able to have access to. All right, so that's me. I do all sorts of different things, working with organizations, speaking, kind of consulting, providing those things. If there's anything at all that you would like from me or resources, I publish a lot of blogs, and they cover a diverse range of different topics. If there's anything in particular that you would like to hear about, or you would like some more information about in any way I can assist you, I would really love to be able to provide you with those resources. It's very important for me to. Oh, she's really on fire today, isn't she? Okay. So I think that it's really important for us to feel that we have a lot of opportunity to move forward and do things in a way that really improves outcomes for the sector. And I really want to help you in any way that you feel you need some guidance or support to move forward. So I don't think that there are any specific questions at this point, but if there's anything that you would like me to answer, please raise your hand, and then you can type in your question or ask your question, and we can have that kind of response, or anything that you might want to put up in that sort of question and answer section that Stephanie may be able to answer for you, or I can answer for you. But I'm aware that we've run 20 minutes over. Okay, so oh my goodness. She really is very annoying today. That's what happened. It's a new one. See, she seems to, I don't know what I'm saying, but I must be saying something that kind of activates her. All right. Unless there's any kind of questions that people put up, doesn't look like anybody's got any burning questions right now. So I hope that was useful. I hope. Yeah, no problem. So Sarah's just saying thank you for the presentation and keeping in touch. That's great. I'm glad. I hope it was useful. I hope that it provides you some insight and some inspiration, and an opportunity to kind of look at things differently for your organisation, because at the end of the day, that's all we really want to try and do, is help to inspire and give you opportunities to improve things for your people. All right. On that note, I will finish up today, and that's great. Sarah just saying, yes, it did. That's fabulous. All right. And please reach out and get some of that further information if you would like to. All right. So on that note, I think I can stop recording, and I will see you soon.